Hello, this is lecture 11 for lifespan development for social work. And our topic this week, as you can see, is gender and sexuality. So what do we mean by gender? Why do boys wear blue and girls wear pink? Basically, gender refers to a person's sense of being male or female. Gender is often incorrectly used in place of the term sex. Sex is the physiological aspects of a person's body, and gender is a person's sense of being male or a man or female or being a woman, that kind of thing. So we want to differentiate between sex, which typically refers to sexual anatomy and or sexual behavior, and gender, which refers to a person's sense of being male or female. Now, there are some differences between boys and girls that are clear from birth. Research has shown that in general, and we're talking about broad generalities now, there's a lot of individual variation within the category boys, and there's a lot of variation within the category girls, and then there's overlap between the two categories of boys and girls. So keeping that in mind, these broad generalizations, research has shown that male infants tend to be more active, more physically active. They tend to be fussier. They have more disturbances in sleep. They grimace more than female infants. There's some evidence that suggests that males are more irritable than females, but there is an inconsistent pattern. And in most ways, infants seem so similar that adults cannot discern between an infant that is a boy and an infant that is a girl. There's also research to show that adults treat children, infants, newborns and infants differently depending on whether that adult thinks that the infant is a boy or a girl. You can even switch up the babies. So you put a female baby in male clothing, blue colors, let's say, give that baby to an adult. The adult assumes, based on the clothing, that the infant is a boy, and many adults treat boy infants differently than girl infants. One of the main ways in which boy infants and girl infants are treated differently is that girl infants tend to be treated more gently, physically more gently. There tends to be more cooing, more reassurances to the female infant. If it's a male infant, if people think that they are interacting with a male infant, then they tend to be a little bit more gruff, a little bit more physically rough with the infant. So there are some kind of differences even from infancy, which we'll get into that in a moment. Well, we're actually going to get into it now. Gender roles are prescribed by culture, and these roles typically differ greatly from one culture to another, especially in the details of what boys or men are supposed to do and what girls and women are supposed to do within that culture. Despite that, there are also similarities across cultures as to what is expected of boys or males and what is expected of girls or females in general. But there are a lot of specific differences across cultures as well. These differences more clearly emerge as children grow older, although, as I just said, there is research to show that even from infancy, a baby will be treated differently based on the gender of the child. Societal encouragement and reinforcement, as well as parental treatment, explains some of the reasons that we see these differences between boys and girls. Because boys are seen to have, there's certain appropriate behaviors associated with being male, and there are certain appropriate behaviors that are associated with being female. And when an infant or when a child exhibits these appropriate behaviors, then they tend to be reinforced by their culture, which means then that the child will engage even further in those so-called appropriate behaviors. Hormones also play a role in inducing these differences between females and males. That is, there's also evidence for that. And these differences can play a profound role in the social and emotional development of infants and children, based on how children are raised. We've already talked about that earlier in the semester, that brain development is very much dependent on what the environment reinforces, encourages, or demands of the infant. Well, this is also true with gender differences. So, for example, there is some evidence to show that male children will tend to be more physically active than female children. There's also evidence to show that female babies tend to start developing their vocal abilities and the vocabulary sooner than male children. Again, these are broad generalizations, and there's plenty of overlap. That is, that there are girl infants that develop a little bit later in their verbal ability, and there are boy infants that develop very soon, even sooner than girl infants in their verbal ability. So there's a lot of variation, and there's overlap. I'm just going to keep repeating that over and over again during this lecture. But there's a lot of overlap between male and female, okay, even within the literature and the research. But having said that, there are these differences, and remember, let's get back to the epigenetic idea, that there's genetics, there's physiology, and then there's society and culture, and everything in between those two kind of extremes, if you will, that influences human behavior. And so it's very, very possible that if girl infants, for example, demonstrate more verbal ability sooner than boy children, then perhaps over generations people began to assume that if a child was an infant, a girl infant, then of course we're going to engage in verbal communication with that infant sooner than with a male child. Well, of course, as we know, if society reinforces a particular behavior and there's that demand placed on the infant from the environment, then the brain will tend to develop in that way, which means then that girls may be reinforced to be more verbal, which means that their brains develop further to be more verbal, which means that they are then more verbal, which then means that the environment will tend to reinforce it again. So there's this kind of feedback loop. And of course the same is true for boy infants as well. So there is this kind of interplay between these kind of genetic differences and physiological or hormonal differences, and then society reinforcing those differences even further, which then highlights the differences even further. Okay, whoops. Gender identity. Basically, differences in the ways boys and girls are treated begin at birth, as I mentioned before, and these continue well into preschool years, extend into adolescence, and then beyond into adult life. Again, gender is the sense of being male or female, and is also, we know from research, well established by young childhood, preschool age. We start seeing children at 3, 4 years old being very clear as to who they believe themselves to be. That is, that I am a boy or I am a girl kind of thing. One way gender is manifested is in play. During the preschool years, boys increasingly play with boys in rough and tumble games, and then girls tend to play with girls. And their play tends to be what they call associative. That is, it's more relationship, it's more kind of role-playing, fantasy play, house, that sort of thing, and involves more verbal skills. Girls tend to choose same-sex playmates about a year younger than boys. Girls, we start seeing this as young as age 2, girls choosing other girls, and boys start to demonstrate this more at around age 3. Gender outweighs ethnic variables when it comes to play in most countries. That means that the way that there's a certain, and this is what I was talking about earlier, despite the fact that there are very specific differences in gender role expectations across culture, what is expected of men, what is expected of women, etc. We do see some universal, very basic, but universal differences between boys and girls in this case, across culture, and we see that in play. So we see this kind of rough and tumble play is more typical of boys cross-culturally, and this more kind of associative play, pro-social behavior, and kind of verbal interactions with girls in their play. Okay, so there is universality to these kind of differences. Preschoolers preschoolers also begin to develop a strict expectation about what's appropriate behavior for a girl or a boy. So we start seeing this especially in 4 and 5-year-olds. They are more often stereotyped than adults, and young children tend to be less flexible in their preschool notions about gender than adolescents or adults. Of course, this is part of the cognitive development that we've already talked about, that they see the world in a more concrete terms as opposed to more abstract terms. And so, of course, this is what boys do, and that's kind of a fixed notion, and this is what girls do, and that's more of a fixed notion because they think in more concrete terms. This adherence to stereotypes increases to about age 5 or so, and still remains somewhat rigid a few years later when we get into older childhood or later childhood. Adults do expect, as well as preschoolers, expect boys to be more independent, to be more competitive, to be more forceful. And they expect girls to be more warm, to be more nurturing, to be more expressive and submissive. And so these are kinds of characteristics that even preschoolers will expect from each other and from adults. They'll expect adults to be to behave this way as well. So explaining gender differences, I've already kind of hinted at this before. There are basically 4 basic approaches. There's the biological approach, the social learning approach, cognitive approaches, and the epigenetic, which I've already mentioned. The biological perspective basically argues that these differences are biologically based. They are associated with the physiological differences between the sexes, between hormonal differences, differences in the structure of the female and the male brain, which then may lead to these observable gender differences. There's also a focus on hormones, how hormones have been found to affect gender-based behaviors. Girls prenatally are exposed to high levels of androgens, which is a male hormone, and are more likely to display male typical behaviors more than their sisters not exposed to these hormones. So the idea is that when in utero, a female, before birth, if during the pregnancy a female child is exposed to androgens or male hormones, they will tend, after birth, once they are born, to exhibit more male typical behaviors. Boys exposed to female hormones prenatally, guess what? They display more female typical behaviors than their male peers. There are also some differences in the corpus callosum, if you remember that bundle of nerve fibers that connects the hemispheres of the 2 hemispheres of the brain. And this tends to be larger in women than for men. This may be due to the fact that girls' greater exposure to verbal interactions rather than to innate biological mechanisms. Remember, if girls are seen to be developing verbal skills sooner, adults will probably engage with that child with verbal activity and verbal interactions, which means then that part of the brain that deals with verbal activity, including the corpus callosum, will develop even further specificity and connectivity. And so this greater mass, if you will, for women in general of the corpus callosum may be due to this kind of interaction of environment and growth. Of course, there may still be biological differences there, even given the environmental influences, and that is what the biological perspective tends to strongly emphasize. This perspective also tends to take an evolutionary approach, which purports that gender differences have served the biological goal of survival of the species. These kind of stereotypical roles ensured attraction and reproduction in earlier generations. Now we're talking about thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, and that this is kind of a vestige. There's still this kind of aspect of ourselves as a species, as well as across individuals, that this will tend to continue to express itself because of the evolutionary advantages that these kind of behaviors gave to the species very early in our development. There's also the social learning approach, which argues that children learn gender-related behavior and expectations from direct training and from the observations of others. And there are some people, some theorists who believe that gender is, and there are no such thing as, except for anatomy, there are really no differences between males and females, and that the only differences are those that are reinforced by culture, by society, or through social learning. There are also the cognitive approaches, which argue that individuals develop a gender identity that is, once a child begins to accept a certain gender identity in their cognitive development, and we're talking about now preschoolers, we're talking about very early in life, once they kind of develop this sense of who they are, they decided, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, etc., then they kind of take on the gender schema that goes along with it. Remember schema? These are the kind of mental categories that we use in our brain for memory and for data, for information. And so the idea is, through cognitive development theory, that children, once they begin to identify themselves as a particular category, let's say boy or girl in this case, then they start to accrue more information as to what is associated with being boy, what's associated with being girl, and therefore they then act out those ideas based on this kind of connection of categories, words, labels based on those categories of being a boy or a girl. The epigenetic, of course, accepts all of the above. It tends to see that, in fact, there is an interplay between genetics. There may have been, or still be, vestigial elements of our evolution that prompts male children to behave in a certain way and female children to behave in another way. And across numerous generations, these differences have been emphasized, have been noted first, and then emphasized, and then even ritualized by society, which then reinforces those differences, which can then reinforce brain development and differences in brain structure, even according to epigenetic theory. So this idea with epigenetic theory is that it is a constant kind of feedback loop across generations and across individuals at any given time. Okay. Another part about gender identity that has really, especially in the last 10 years, I would say, we've really started to talk more about transsexual, transsexuality, transgender, trans, which is a kind of a more umbrella term, gender queer, gender nonconforming. These are kinds of terms that have kind of have arisen within the literature, within research, when we start talking about gender, and especially gender identity. Transsexuality is essentially when a person identifies that their psychological identity of being either male or female is trapped in the physical body of the wrong gender. This is probably many people or more people are aware of this notion when we talk about gender identity nowadays, especially when we talk about trans issues or transsexuality in this particular case. It's the idea that a person is trapped. They feel themselves to be male, but they are in a female body, and so therefore they feel trapped by this experience, and they then begin a period of transitioning. Some individuals, at least, begin a period of transitioning from living their lives as the sex that they were assigned, the gender, I should say, that they were assigned earlier in life. People see male genitalia of an infant and they assume male gender on that infant, on that child. But there are some people, we are learning, and this has been known actually for about 50, 60 years, if not longer, that there are those individuals who, despite that assignment, quote unquote, assignment at birth, that individual still experiences themselves as the other sex. Okay? And Chaz Bono is probably the most obvious example of that nowadays. There have always been certain people throughout time that have identified as such. And even in the last 50 years here in the United States, we have had various different transsexuals, individuals who identify as transsexual, who come out, if you will, who talk about this publicly, and that person is known in general by the general population. So transsexuality even includes the idea of transitioning not only to live as the sex, or the gender I should say, that they feel themselves to be, but also changing their bodies through hormonal treatment, through surgical procedures, etc., so that their body conforms more to who they are and how they experience themselves to be. But there are other ways of describing of gender identity that are becoming much more, I think, are better known, at least within the literature, and within the trans community. I would even say trans communities, within the GLBT communities, etc. Transgender, this tends to be a broader term that includes and is sometimes used interchangeably with the word transsexual. It can include individuals who are the more, what I would call traditional, that's my term, transsexual, to those who experience very similar things but choose to not pursue as much body modification for a wide host of reasons, such as from lack of insurance coverage, lack of financial resources, lack of advanced surgical procedures that provide satisfactory results, to more socio-political reasons, such as rejecting the notion that gender is purely binary, that gender is only male or female, and it's categorical, that in fact there could be many genders, if you will, as opposed to just two. Trans is another umbrella term that some people use as a shorthand for the previous two terms that I've just mentioned. Genderqueer. This is a term that is sometimes used by an individual that experiences themselves as being both masculine and feminine. Typically, such an individual may reject the cultural gender binary of male and female. They may or may not modify their bodies to conform to their sense of their gender, of a unique gender, if you will, that goes beyond male or female. And then gender nonconforming is a term that has sometimes been used both in the trans community as well in the scholarship and in research. This is a very broad term. It sometimes refers to a child who does not act in gender-specific ways based on the child's sex. So you may have a more feminine boy or a more masculine girl, tomboy. One could say that's gender nonconforming. In the literature now, I'm talking about within psychological, sociological research. There is some research to suggest that a higher proportion of gender nonconforming children grow up to later identify as gay or lesbian and or trans. So these are kind of new areas, if you will, at least new to the research, let's say. It's not to say that there have not been individuals like this across time and across history, but the idea of identifying and then studying these kind of gender identities that people experience is relatively new. Okay, let's move a little bit further with sexual maturation and sexuality. Some aspects of puberty carry a lot of psychological weight for adolescents. I think we've already talked about that. Girls today view menarche positively compared to, or more neutrally, compared to the way girls looked at menarche in previous generations. Western society's views of menarche has become more positive than they used to be. Girls tend to have higher self-esteem, a rise in status and self-awareness when they begin menstruating. So there's this kind of more positive look on this aspect of development in general. A boy's first ejaculation is roughly equivalent to a girl's menarche, but it is rarely discussed. This is often not talked about. Girls are often unhappy with their developing bodies as a result of strong societal pressures regarding the ideal female shape. So we start seeing these kinds of experiences, unique experiences based on puberty and the onset of puberty. First ejaculate, the beginning of menstruation, of the menstruation process, etc. And what eventually really a key issue around sexual maturation is when the timing of puberty for that particular individual. Early maturation is generally a positive thing for boys. Early maturing boys tend to be better at athletics. They tend to be more popular. They tend to report higher levels of self-esteem. And they grow up to be more cooperative and responsible, according to the literature. They are also more likely to have school difficulties, and they become more involved in delinquency and substance abuse because of their appearing older. They often have older friends who may lead them in this direction. They may be more conforming and lacking in humor as well, according to some literature. So that's some of the literature or research about boys who mature earlier. Girls who mature earlier tend to have more difficulties. They tend to report more difficulties. Early maturing girls tend to be more popular, but they may not be ready to deal with dating situations. And also the reactions of developing earlier in life or have an earlier onset of puberty can also depend on cultural norms. There may be higher expectation placed on girls who mature earlier than girls who mature later. And that can also create difficulties for that particular girl. I want to get back to dating. When we talk about dating, sometimes girls who mature earlier are sometimes older boys may be interested in them. These girls may face greater pressure to become sexually active sooner. So that also can be a challenge for girls who mature early. Later maturation tends to be a greater difficulty for boys. Smaller boys are seen as less attractive, and they do have a disadvantage in sports. Their dating lives may suffer. They may start dating at a later age than their early maturing male counterparts. These difficulties can lead to a decline in self-concept or self-esteem, which can extend into adulthood. However, coping with these challenges may help later maturing boys to become more assertive, insightful, and more creative. And for some reason, later maturing boys tend to have a better sense of humor than earlier maturing boys. I have no idea what that's all about, but that's some of the literature does demonstrate that. For late maturing girls, the picture is more complicated. Late maturing girls can be overlooked and have low social status at first. Okay. However, when they catch up, as far as their maturation is concerned, their self-esteem then increases, and with higher body self-esteem, they become, because also, I should mention, this is also a common occurrence. It's not always true, but this is a common occurrence, that girls who mature later, that is, the onset of puberty is later in life, tend to have slender bodies, tend to have longer legs than their early maturing female counterparts, and this may give them a higher social esteem because their bodies may conform more to the ideal of female beauty. So this is kind of the interesting kind of experience for girls in general. Girls who mature earlier tend to hit that kind of ideal, that female ideal, sooner in life, and they are given higher advantages or esteem culturally. But girls who mature later will hit that as well and tend to have that kind of body form later into adulthood. So this is kind of a more complicated picture for girls, for puberty, because of societal norms, which, of course, in my mind, that's not a surprise that there are those kinds of complications for girls, given the social norms around physical beauty that girls and women are faced with in our culture. becoming sexual, adolescence is not the first time individuals think about sex, but at the onset of puberty, sexuality becomes a greater central aspect of life. It is during adolescence that many people begin to explore sexuality in different types of way. One of these is through masturbation, which is self-gratification, sexual self-gratification. And for many adolescents, this is the initiation into their own sexuality and being sexual. Boys tend to start this a bit sooner than girls, but the frequency at which they masturbate decreases as they get older. The frequency may be lower for girls initially, but may increase as girls get older. There are some differences across ethnic communities as to their attitudes regarding masturbation and how often people may engage in that. There have been historically very negative views about masturbation in American society, in mainstream culture. There is still some shame that is associated with masturbation or taboo around this. 100 years ago, there were some very serious misconceptions about masturbation as it having a very negative impact on development, on growth, on the mental health of the individual. All of these are untrue. Research has shown that none of these are accurate. Although some of these attitudes and some of these myths about masturbation have kind of gone to the wayside, there's still some shame or negativity that's associated with masturbation. Sexual intercourse or sexual activity in general with another person remains a major milestone in the perception of most adolescents, and as such it becomes a major focus for adolescents and also a major focus for research with adolescents. Most children, most adolescents I should say, regardless of their inevitable sexual orientation or expression later in life, do investigate heterosexual sex and heterosexual intercourse at some point in their lives. The ages of sexual intercourse have been declining. So 1 in 5 adolescents have had sex before the age of 15. Over half begin having intercourse between the ages of 15 and 18. And 80% have had sex before the age of 20, some kind of sexual activity before the age of 20. So this is a much earlier age range than, let's say, 50 years ago. And we're talking about by a number of a few years, by 4 or 5 years difference from one generation from 50 years ago to now. Also, there's this whole notion of the double standard in which premarital sex, or just being sexually active in general, was considered permissible for males, and in fact an expectation, kind of almost a rite of passage for males, but not for females. And so this has largely been supplanted by a permissiveness with affection, where this is the idea where premarital intercourse is viewed as permissible for both men and women if it occurs in the context of a long-term committed loving relationship. Okay. So premarital sex at one time was taboo, although it was more permissible for boys, adolescent boys, than for adolescent girls. There was the bad girl, the good girl. The bad girls were the ones who were sexually active with males. The good girls, of course, waited to have their first sexual intercourse on their wedding night. This is kind of the notion of about 50 years ago, although that was already changing even 50 years ago. Now, with the advent of particularly contraceptions, widely used and widely available contraception, and readily available contraception, this attitude has changed to what we call permissiveness with affection. So that sexual activity before marriage is permitted as long as it's within the context of a loving, committed relationship. That's not to say that all sex occurs within those contexts, of course, including for adolescents. And I would argue that it's probably still more permissible for males to be sexually active outside of this kind of permissiveness with affection than it is for girls, for females. Okay. Which leads us to the next topic around sexual orientation. And when we talk about sexual orientation, people typically think about gay, lesbian. That's about it. But really, sexual orientation deals with heterosexuality, bisexuality, queer. We talk about queer, quote unquote queer, asexuality. We'll get into all of these. The most frequent pattern of sexual orientation in adolescence, sexual development, is heterosexuality. And that is sexual attraction and behavior directed to the other sex. This is kind of a more binary approach. We have boys, we have girls, males, females. Males are attracted to females, females are attracted to males, and they often couple together, come together in a long-term relationship. Sometimes this produces children, sometimes not. But nonetheless, this is kind of the standard and the majority, the experience of the majority around their sexuality. Some identify as homosexual. This is a kind of a more clinical term. Typically, we use the terms gay or gay male, lesbian for women, and their sexual attraction and behavior are oriented to members of their own sex. Many men prefer the term gay as opposed to homosexual, and many women prefer the term lesbian, although occasionally the word gay is used interchangeably for men and women, depending on who you're talking to, what you're reading, etc. But generally, gay refers to men, lesbian refers to women. These terms can be used to refer to a broad range of experiences, feelings, relationships, etc. There's a broad range of experience of what it means to be lesbian, what it means to be gay, across lesbians, across gay men, although there are also these subcultures, communities, gay communities, lesbian community, where people of like mind, of like experiences come together for similar interests, as well as to advocate for their rights under the law. Others report being bisexual, and this is really people who are sexually attracted to people of both sexes. Now, there's also a term pansexual, and this is the idea of not only being bisexual, that is male-female, but being attracted to a person regardless of their gender. Because remember, we were talking about that there are people who believe that gender is beyond just two categories, that there are multiple categories, and so people who are pansexual will tend to report being attracted to different types of people, regardless of their gender. It should be noted that research has shown that people do experiment with homosexuality. Although heterosexual behavior is by far the majority of what people experiment with in adolescence, at least 20 to 25% of boys and about 10% of girls report at least one encounter with same-sex activity. And so that's important to know, that people also experiment with that as well. But given that experimentation in adolescence, you can have somebody who's experimented heterosexual who later identifies as lesbian, and you can have somebody who has experimented with homosexual activity in adolescence, but later goes on to identify as heterosexual. Okay. Alfred Kinsey, of course, if you're not familiar with him, please look him up. He was a sex researcher. He was the one who first argued that orientation should be viewed as a continuum, not exclusively heterosexual or homosexual, but a continuum between those two categories, just as there are trans activists and gender activists who would say that there is a spectrum between male and female, that gender is not just a binary, two categories. Sexual orientation, gender identity, these are related in very complicated ways. Just because somebody identifies as gay does not necessarily mean that they were born male, with a male body. They may have been born with a male body, I should say with a female body. They identify as male, they transition to living their lives as men, but find other men to be attractive. So this could be a trans man who finds other men attractive and identifies as a gay male. So it's important to understand those kinds of things. Orientation refers to the object of one's interests and behaviors, and gender identity is is that aspect of the person that identifies as a type of gender. The two are not always predictive of each other. The other thing I want to mention is queer. Queer can be used as an umbrella term to include lesbian, bi, gay, pansexual, etc. It's kind of an umbrella term. Some people use it as a primary term of identifying their sexuality. There are some people now who are identifying as asexual, that they don't experience a strong sexuality or no sexuality at all towards others. They see this as their kind of baseline, their default approach to life, and identify themselves as asexual. Causes of sexual orientation. You know, in the past, when we talked about causes of sexual orientation, we were always talking about homosexuality. Freud even also included bisexuality in his ideas. But typically research was always focused on why are people same-sex attracted, basically. Now we're interested in all types of sexualities, including heterosexuality. What is it that causes the majority of people to be heterosexual? Why shouldn't we understand that? What causes an eye to be blue? What causes an eye to be brown? This is not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just an interest in research. And so the research now has broadened itself to not just look at same-sex attraction, but also looking at heterosexuality, bisexuality, which also can be included in same-sex attracted research, as well as gender identity, which is a whole other topic of conversation. But let's focus on sexual orientation. The causes or the reasons why people are the way they are around their sexual orientation are not well understood. There is some biological and probably genetic factors that seem to play an important role in a person's sexual orientation. Psychological theories attributing cause to peers or family do not hold up, because no one type of family or social dynamic is related to sexual orientation. So any theory that tries to claim that if the classic model for a homogenetic family, which goes back 50 years ago, was the overbearing mother and the distant father. And this is what caused, for example, male homosexuality. And there's no evidence for this in the literature. Yes, there are some gay men who report having this kind of family dynamic, but there are plenty of gay men who don't report this. And guess what? There are heterosexual men who report this in their families and do not develop to be a homosexual identity or sexual attraction in that way. Also, you might be interested to know that this idea of this kind of family was also thought to cause schizophrenia. It was also thought to cause depression. It was thought to cause lots of different dysfunctional things in individuals. And as we say in theory building, when a theory explains everything, it essentially doesn't explain anything at all. So think about that for a moment. When a theory explains everything, it doesn't explain anything at all, because it's so nonspecific, it's so broad, it's so general that it doesn't explain anything specific. And so these kind of psychological theories just do not hold up in the literature and in research. Most experts believe that orientation develops out of a complex interaction of genetics, physiological, psychological, and environmental factors. This is true for all sexual orientations, by the way. Gay adolescents, gay, lesbian, and lesbian, I'll just use the term, a broader term, same-sex attracted adolescents often have a very difficult time, and they are at greater risk for depression and suicide due to prejudice, due to social pressures, etc. Disclosing same-sex attraction for adolescents, for young adults, to parents, to loved ones, to peers, etc., can be a complicated a difficult task. Sometimes it can be easy. We're seeing more and more younger adolescents who report that the process was relatively smooth for them, but it still can be a difficult process for the majority of adolescents. One of the ways that people do this, self-disclosing their same-sex attraction, is by disclosing it first to a sibling who they feel very close to a friend. They may report it to only one parent as opposed to the other. The mother tends to be the parent that is chosen the most, although this is not completely, some people choose their father. Interestingly enough, research shows that fathers, when they do find out, they typically find out by accident, as opposed to being told directly. And teens, of course, adolescents, as well as adults, choose not to tell anyone for a wide range of reasons. So each individual can have a different trajectory as to how they reveal or disclose, I should say, their same-sex attractions. Okay, let's move to now teenage pregnancy. Every minute of every day, an adolescent in the United States gives birth to a child. When we're talking about adolescents, we're talking about people at the ages of 17 and younger. Okay. Despite this, however, the rate of teen pregnancy has dropped by 30% in the last 10 years. Awareness of risks of unprotected sex has risen amongst teens, and this is probably why we've seen some of that drop. Also, the rate of intercourse has declined amongst teenagers from 51 to 43%. So from 1991 to 2001, I'd like to see more. This is kind of an old study. When I'm reading it, I'm thinking this is 2001. I'd like to see what it would be 2001 to 2011, if that trend is still occurring. But what we see is that teen pregnancies and sexual activity, including knowledge about unprotected sex, about sexually transmitted diseases, about avoiding pregnancy, often this goes up and down across generations of teens. So there is a correlation that when teens, not causation, but a correlation, there is some kind of relationship, that when teens report a greater knowledge of contraception, avoiding pregnancy, and avoiding sexually transmitted diseases or safe sex, the birth rates, or the pregnancy rates, I should say, of adolescents decreases. Okay. I should also note that recently there have been what have been called virginity pledges. And there's also been studies that have looked at abstinence-only programs as a way of approaching teen sexuality in schools. Abstinence-only programs do not work according to the literature and the research. In fact, there's some studies that state that teen pregnancies actually increase and teen pregnancies occur earlier in life with abstinence-only programs. This is not to say that abstinence should not be taught. Abstinence should be taught, but as a broad spectrum of information about sexuality, sexual activity, pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, etc. These programs tend to work the best for decreasing teen pregnancies and unsafe sex. Let's see. The rate of teen pregnancies in America has always tended to be substantially higher than the rates in other industrialized countries. And there's a lot of theories as to why that is. Some would argue that because we don't have adequate health, there isn't adequate health care for adolescents. Agencies like Planned Parenthood are often under duress publicly, and yet they do a lot of outreach to unwed mothers or women in adolescence who have unwanted pregnancies. Some argue that it's because of we have a lack of really teaching adolescents. We don't talk about it in the home. So there's lots of reasons as to why this might be the case for this occurring more often in the United States compared to other other industrialized countries. Interestingly enough, another aspect, I should say, of teenage pregnancy is that teenage pregnancies can often have a dramatic and sometimes negative impact on that of the life of the teenage mother, as well as the family in general. Not just the family that maybe the teenage girl has perhaps with a partner, but with her family. Teenage pregnancies often involve the mother leaving the school. She may find herself for long periods of time involved with low-paying jobs or needing to be on welfare. This can create a cycle of poverty for both the mother and for the child, or for any future children that come into the home. Children from teenage homes are at higher risk for poor health, for performing poorly in school, and are more likely to become teenage parents themselves. So sometimes we see this across generations. Not always, but sometimes we see that occurring. So, so it can create a cycle. Teenage pregnancies, especially ones that were not planned for, that there's a difference between people who marry very young, they want to have a family, and they start a family younger in life, versus those who have teenage pregnancies that are unexpected, unplanned. Nonetheless, earlier pregnancies and births for a girl, for an adolescent girl, do pose higher risks for both that girl, the mother, as well as for the children. We also, we've only been talking about adolescence now with sexuality, but I'd like to kind of push up to the latter end of the lifespan. And there's this notion that sexuality ends somewhere, maybe in midlife, later, or early young adult, older adult life. But in fact, we know from the research and literature that sexuality and sexual activity continues well into older adulthood. Evidence suggests that sexual activity continues well into the 80s and 90s. Typically, sexual activity is typically what would interfere with sexual activity are health problems, health difficulties. But having said that, even people with some form of medical problem still engage in sexual activity well into older adulthood. Overall, good physical health, overall, good mental health, previous regular sexual activity, all of these contribute to the increased likelihood of sexual activity amongst older adults. Regular sexual activity is associated with lower risks for death. That's true across the lifespan, not just for older adulthood. Many women and men over the age of 70 masturbate at least once a week on average. So that activity continues. As people age, their view of their spouses as physically attractive actually increases. So there's this idea that as we get older, we start feeling bad about our bodies, and there is some truth to this. People struggle with these kind of norms, expectations, etc. about physical images. We talked about that earlier in the semester. But there's also some literature to show that as people get older, and maybe they've been married for a while to their spouse, they report that they find their spouse even more physically attractive as they get older. So there's this kind of reverse trend. Maybe there's a period of time where people say, oh, we're getting older in middle adult life. Maybe we don't find our spouses that physically attractive anymore. But then this reverses in older adulthood for a lot of older couples. So sexuality, sexual activity does continue into older adulthood. There's also been some literature that and research that there's a need to talk about safe sex with older adults, that there has actually been an increase of HIV transmission amongst older adults. And so there have been some efforts in the last 10 years or so to reach out to this community so they are better informed about how to prevent sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. Okay, let's see. So let's reverse back to young adulthood. So we talked about adolescence. I like to talk about older adults, just so that you know that sexuality continues across the life cycle. But now we're going to kind of reverse back to young adulthood, and we're going to start talking about issues around intimacy, relationships, building. I'm talking about more intimate, loving, long-term relationship building between two individuals, etc. And this brings us back to Erikson's idea about intimacy versus isolation stage. Really, young adulthood is a time of relationship formation. And I want to kind of say that relationship formation, not just around intimacy, coupling, let's say, but also relationship building across colleagues, across friends, new types of relationships with parents and families of origin. So it's all about this kind of, I'm an adult now, creating adult-to-adult relationships, which includes the idea of coupling, couplehood, marriage, intimacy, etc. And if you remember, Erikson talked about that this is a major issue for young adulthood. This is a major crisis for adulthood, in which young adulthood focuses on developing close, intimate relationships with others. Many young adults, according to research, link their overall happiness and their sense of well-being to their relationship status. So we see that young adults may report, who are single in this case, may report feeling less positively about themselves if they are single, as opposed to those who are in relationships. And then when we look at those who are in relationships, young adults, those who report being in a much more troubled relationship will report, probably for obvious reasons, a poor sense of self and a poor sense of well-being. So this relationship status and where the relationship's at, if the person's in a relationship, these are heavily tied in with a young adult's sense of well-being and self-esteem, at least according to the literature. Falling in love. What do we know about falling in love and creating relationships? Most relationships develop in a surprisingly regular progression. Two people often interact with each other, and they interact with each other more often and for longer periods of time. This is before relationship develops, by the way. The two people become increasingly seek each other's company. They realize that there's a mutual attraction and affection for each other. They open up more and more, and they begin to share physical intimacies with each other. The couple is more willing to share positive and negative feelings, criticism and praise with each other, so they become much more vulnerable and open to each other emotionally and psychologically. They begin to agree on goals that they would hold together. They start looking at the future as something that includes both of them together as a couple. They begin to feel their psychological well-being is tied to the success of the relationship. They view this relationship as unique, irreplaceable, and cherished. And they begin to see themselves as a couple rather than as separate individuals. Excuse me. They actually begin to describe themselves as a couple versus rather than just simply, quote unquote, simply separate individuals. Of course, not all love is the same. There's this kind of what we call passionate or romantic love, and then there's companionate love. Passionate or romantic love is that state of positive, powerful absorption with another person. This includes an intense interest and physical arousal, as well as emotional arousal for another person. Companionate love tends to be a strong affection that a person has for another. and they feel deeply involved with that individual, but there's not necessarily a strong emotional intenseness. There is a strong, I should say, a strong emotional connection, but it's not as intense or as powerful or as absorbing as passionate or romantic love can tend to be. According to Elaine Hatfield and Ellen Burschild's labeling theory of passionate love, individuals experience romantic love when two events occur together. There's an intense physiological arousal, and there are situational cues suggesting that the arousal is due to love. This is plausible in Western cultures because romantic love is highly valued in Western cultures. It's seen as a very desirable experience. But in many cultures, passionate romantic love is a foreign concept. Companionate love tends to be fairly universal, and that tends to be universal across cultures as well as across the lifespan of a couple together. And in fact, we see this happening, that there may be periods of romantic, passionate love within the lifespan of a couple's life, but what's really going to be more typically found day to day and across the life of the couple is what we call companionate love. Okay, then we have Sternberg's triangular theory, or what he calls the three facts of love. Triangular theory of love hypothesizes that love is made up of three components. There's the intimacy, passion, and decision commitment components. The intimacy component encompasses feelings of closeness, affection, and connectedness. Passion refers to the motivational drives related to sex, physical closeness, and emotional romance. And then the commitment or decision commitment component embodies both the initial cognition that one loves another person and the longer-term determination to maintain that love with that individual, maintain the relationship and love with the other individual. This is an interesting approach to looking at the different components of love. And Sternberg basically felt that each of these components were a part of a relationship, of a romantic, long-term loving relationship. There can be lots of unique combinations of love that can be formed. Non-love occurs in the absence of all three components. And this may be present, this may occur when couples decide to separate, divorce, or end their relationship. Liking develops when only intimacy is present. Infatuated love exists for those who only feel passion. Empty love, is when only the decision commitment is present. Romantic love occurs when both intimacy and passion are present. Compassionate love is when intimacy and decision commitment are present. Fatuous love exists when passion and decision commitment are present. And consummate love is when all three are present. So you can have a combination of these three different aspects of love based according to Sternberg. Kind of an interesting way of looking at romantic relationships. Now, same-sex relationships, really research shows that same-sex relationships are quite similar to relationships between for heterosexual couples in terms of appreciation of the partner, lack or level of conflict, positive feelings, the mutual feelings and care and concern that are present. Age preferences are also similar, although lesbian age preferences fall somewhere between those of heterosexual women and heterosexual men. Age preferences is just how much age differences there are between the spouses. And we see in heterosexual couples there tends to be a smaller gap of age differences between the man and the woman. Same-sex couples, we see that there can be a broader range. Most gays and lesbians seek loving, long-term, and meaningful relationships that really differ little from other relationships. Okay. Choosing a partner. Across different cultures, the value of love as a major factor in choosing spouses varies. Some cultures arrange marriages, and then other cultures leave it up completely to that of individuals. When we look at cultures that leave it up to individuals to find each other and to form their own relationships together, romantic love becomes more important. When we're looking at relationships that are more arranged, then companionate love tends to be more important at the beginning, I should say. Although love and mutual attraction are relatively highly desired characteristics across all cultures, basically, some preferred characteristics are similar across cultures, such as dependability, emotional stability. They are pleasing. They have a pleasing disposition. They are intelligent. So these are aspects of a spouse that are seen across sexual orientation and seen across age, the age of the persons that are involved with the relationship, as well as across culture. Men more than women prefer a marriage partner who is physically attractive. Men report this more often. Women prefer a marriage partner who's ambitious and industrious. David Boos believes we are programmed to seek our mates who will maximize the availability of beneficial genes. So you could tell where he's coming from with his theory, that he comes from a more evolutionary biological perspective about what prompts people to partner in the first place. Critics argue that similarities reflect gender stereotyping and have nothing to do with evolution. The theory as it is posed is untestable. That is David Boos's theory of why we choose the mate that we choose. It's very difficult to test this kind of hypothesis out. But we do have some research to show that certain things occur that tend to influence what causes or what prompts a person to choose another person to be their romantic partner. People often marry according to what we call the principle of homogamy. And that is the tendency to marry someone who is similar in age, similar in race, similar in education level, similar in religion, and other basic demographic characteristics. Now, this other person doesn't have to be completely similar to the other person, right? But the more characteristics they are similar, the more likely there may be mutual attraction between the partners and a long-term relationship. The marriage gradient is the tendency for men to marry women who are slightly younger, smaller, and lower in status, and for women to marry men who are slightly older, larger, and higher in status. Now, this kind of marriage gradient or partner gradient is not necessarily seen with same-sex couples. Okay, we see this less occurring. We see more homogamy, actually, than this kind of marriage gradient, which is based on this kind of gender binary that men are this way, women are that way, and so we see this kind of these kind of overall choices that men and women make. Because of this, men will tend to have a larger pool to choose from than women in general. We're talking about heterosexual men having a larger pool of women to choose from than vice versa. So this is something just to think about, maybe in one's own life as well in the lives of those of your friends, your families, members, etc. These are the norms. This is kind of how people tend to choose their partner. Do adult loving styles reflect attachment from infancy? Remember our attachment theory from earlier in this semester? Some people do argue that attachment style from infancy can be reflected in the kind of relationship that individual has later in life. According to Philip Shaver and colleagues, the influence of an infant's attachment style continues well into adulthood and affects the nature of romantic relationships. So adults with a secure attachment readily enter into relationships and feel happy and confident about the future of their relationships. Okay? That's an example. Adults with an avoidant attachment tend to be less invested in relationships and have a higher breakup rate. And those who have an anxious avoidant attachment tend to become overly invested in relationships and have repeated breakups with the same partner and have relatively low self-esteem. I will add that the literature is not strong regarding this theory of infant attachment style being reflected in later adult life. Some of this research is based on self-report and on retrospective interviews. That is, adults are interviewed as adults, and they're asked about their attachment styles from earlier in life, and then they are asked about their present relationships. It is very possible that there's a strong bias. The best kinds of research are longitudinal research, and the research that I am familiar with shows that there can be a later effect based on earlier infant attachment styles up to about the age of 4 or 5 for the individual. I do not know of any longitudinal research that says that this can also be reflected in the relationship choices that people make as young adults. One thing we've been talking about relationships, but singlehood, that is living alone without an intimate partner, has actually increased over the last few decades. And I just saw a recent study report that says about 25% of adults in America are single and are not married. And in fact, that this number is increasing more and more. It's the fastest growing type of family, if you will, or household, to be more accurate. It's the fastest kind of household that is growing in the United States, and that is singles. Fewer people are married than ever before in the United States. That includes those who are in a relationship without marriage, those who are divorced, and those who have never been married. So we have more and more people who are not married in the United States than ever before. At one time in the United States, 90 to 95% of the populace was married. Think about that. Nowadays we're looking at about 70%. So that's changed substantially. Also, part of this might be because, 1, it's less stigmatizing to be single. 2, women have greater financial freedom and independence, so they don't necessarily have to be married, or they don't have to remain in marriages that they don't want to be in. And same also for men as well. Some of this is the expanding life cycle, life expectancy. So people are delaying marriage. People are delaying rearing children, having children and rearing children. So we're seeing more and more people who are choosing to be single or choosing to be unmarried or cohabitate. Okay. Divorce. An interesting fact about divorce is this. The first 10 years of a marriage are the probably most, not the most important, but can be the most vulnerable years of that relationship. Because usually when a divorce occurs in a relationship, it occurs within the first 10 years of the marriage. Overall, however, divorce rates have been declining over the last 20 to 30 years. Although that's kind of I would say in the last 5 years, that has kind of plateaued now. I don't think it's really diminishing anymore. I think it's kind of plateaued. Middle-aged adults spend less time with their spouses than they did in earlier years. I should say many factors contribute to these rates of divorce. I'm sorry, I kind of skipped my thought there. Middle-aged adults spend less time with their spouses than in previous generations, and so people may grow apart or just move apart. Focus on personal happiness rather than commitment to a marriage have increased over time. The social acceptability of divorce has increased, Yeah, I've already talked about the fact that women have greater financial independence, so women don't have to remain in relationships or feel less dependent upon their male partners. There's a subsiding romantic or passionate love over time. There may be less emphasis on a companionate relationship versus a romantic relationship in the West. Energy is directed towards work, and work can just basically, demands of work, the pressures of work, can create a relationship that grows apart. The people grow apart due to these workforce related stresses. Typically, divorce is difficult for both partners. This is true for young adults as well as middle-aged adults. I don't know about the literature for older adults who divorce, though. That's an interesting thing that I just thought of at this point. But we do know that for young adults and middle-aged adults, that divorce can be a very difficult process. Sometimes women in particular, particularly middle-aged women, may face difficulty finding work if they've not been a part of the workforce for a while, or have only been working part-time. They may have delayed job training, schooling, etc., to raise a family, to be a part of the marriage. So when they are faced with divorce, they may find it more difficult to re-enter school, to re-enter training, to find work in the world of work because they are older, simply because of age discrimination, which we've already talked about early in the semester. About 80% of divorced people find themselves marrying again, and usually within 2 years of being divorced, and to another who has also experienced divorce. Women do not remarry as often as men, especially older women who get divorced. The marriage gradient that I've just talked to you about may explain some of these differences between men and women with divorce, as also social norms around age, beauty, and attraction. So an older man has more options, has more choices for female partners. An older woman may have fewer choices because of these norms and biases against women and those who are older. Also, one motivation to remarry in midlife is to avoid the social stigma that comes as a consequence of divorce. Marriage is associated with increased reports of life satisfaction. This is particularly true for men. Some women may choose not to get remarried because of their experiences of marriage. And so they choose to remain. They may become involved with another partner, but they may choose to remain in that partnership without marriage. Marriage, nonetheless, has clear economic benefits for both partners involved. This is certainly some of the motivation for same-sex couples wanting equal recognition of their marriages under the law to that of heterosexual marriages. It should be noticed that divorce rates amongst those who have been divorced before, amongst remarriages, is slightly higher than for first marriages. Some of the ideas as to why this may be is that since partners have already experienced divorce, going through another divorce, although may be difficult, they've already experienced it, so it may be an easier option for them to choose. Also, there may be the personality of the individual. Maybe this individual should not be married in the first place. There are some people who are probably better off not being married than being in a marriage. And so there are some of those issues as well. Okay, and finally, marriage in later life. More men over 65 years of age are married than women. Why is that? Because women frequently outlive their spouses. I think we talked about this earlier in the semester, that the life expectancy of men is shorter. And there's lots of different reasons and theories as to why men do not live as long as women in general. So when we're looking at men over the age of 65, a higher percentage of them will be married compared to their female peers, because the female peers may have already lost their spouse. The majority of people who are still married in later life are very satisfied with their marriages. And this makes sense if you think about it. Those who were unhappy with their relationship probably got divorced earlier in their lives. So those who have remained married all that time probably have had a fairly okay to very good marriage relationship, and so this just remained into older adult life. Partners experience life changes. The marriage may undergo a stress even in older adulthood. At least 2% of divorces in the U.S. involve a woman who's over the age of 60 years. So divorce still occurs, even amongst long-term relationships. Older women typically divorce their husbands, mostly due to abuse or alcoholism on the husband's part. This may have been present on and off throughout the relationship. It may have recently developed, maybe in the most recent period of that couple's life together. Men more frequently seek divorce from women because there is a younger woman in their lives. So when we're looking at older men, they typically divorce to marry a younger woman. Divorce at any age is particularly difficult for women who may view their severed relationships as being due to their own failure. Women often report divorce, and this is across the life cycle. We see this in older adult women as well, but we see this also in middle-aged and younger women. Never married individuals, that's about 5% of the older population, report feeling less lonely than most people their own age and have a greater sense of independence. I think we often assume that people who have never been married or who have been single the majority of their lives are unhappy people. But remember, when we talked about young adulthood, that may be the case. But as we go across the life cycle into middle adulthood and later adulthood, that's less the case. And so we find that older adults who have been single much of their lives or who have never been married report actually feeling fairly comfortable with their lives, having a greater sense of independence, etc. So these are very interesting details about love, marriage, sex, sexuality, gender identification that we covered during today's lecture, this week's lecture. Remember to watch 2 videos: The Truth About Sex and Aging, which deals with aging and sexuality in middle to later adulthood, and What is Bisexuality, which is kind of a basic overview and introduction to the term and to the subject matter. Thank you for your attention, and see you next week.